The fire crackles gently beside you, its glow casting slow golden shapes that dance across stone walls and old wooden beams. The world outside has long grown quiet, save for the distant hoot of an owl or the soft whinny of a resting horse in the stable. The medieval night has fallen, and with it, the ancient rhythms of rest begin. Tonight we wander back in time, not to wars or kings, but to something far quieter, more intimate. We return to the gentle, almost forgotten rituals of medieval bedtime, a time when people lit candles with trembling hands, whispered prayers to unseen saints, and lay beneath woolen blankets wondering if their dreams would bring comfort or messages from another world. This was a time when the dark was truly dark, and sleep was not just rest but a ritual, a way to protect oneself from spirits, a moment to share warmth in crowded beds, or to reflect in lonely silence. The day was for toil, but the night belonged to superstition, to family, to whispered stories and flickering light. So settle in, let the day fall away, and allow yourself to be gently carried to a time of cloaks and candlelight, where bedtime was sacred, and the quiet moments before sleep were steeped in ritual, reflection, and the soft hum of a medieval world preparing to dream. You're listening to boring history for sleep, and tonight history will tuck you in. Why medieval people feared the dark? Darkness in the medieval world was not simply the absence of light. It was a living presence, a thing that breathed around the thatched eaves of cottages and crept along the twisting corridors of stone halls. It was a visitor unwelcome, yet always expected, returning each evening with the setting sun, uninvited but inevitable. And so the people of the medieval world learned to respect it, to fear it, to prepare for it like one prepares for a storm or a sickness. Imagine a world without electricity, no hum of appliances, no distant glow of street lamps, no subtle shimmer of moonlight bouncing off city glass. The medieval night was thick. In a peasant's hut, it settled like wool soaked in ink. In a noble's chamber, it drew heavy curtains across the senses. Torches burned low, candles guttered, and once they were extinguished, once the hearth burned to embers. Nothing remained but shadow and silence. And in that silence, imagination flourished. In many villages, the night was a realm of spirits. It was when the dead walked more freely, when the devil whispered more clearly, when strange creatures roamed the roads between towns. People spoke of the mare, a malevolent spirit who sat upon a sleeper's chest, choking the breath from them, stealing rest and replacing it with nightmares. It was the very origin of the word nightmare, and the fear of it was so potent that people would place iron knives beneath their pillows, believing it might ward off the weight of invisible evil. Some whispered of witches who flew through the air at dusk, clothed in shadow, seeking barns and bedrooms where they might slip in and steal the soul of a babe. Others feared the strigoi, those who returned from the grave, pale and blood, hungry, drifting between the stones of the churchyard. Not quite alive and not quite gone, these were not just tales. They were part of nightly rituals, locks checked twice, crosses kissed, beds circled with salt in the poorest households, where the only protection was faith and a little superstition. And it was not just what lurked in the supernatural dark that made it frightening. The earthly dangers were just as real, if not more so. Without moonlight or torch, paths were treacherous, forests swallowed the careless whole, bandits and thieves, unseen by torchlight, waited in the woods or along the roads. Doors were bolted, not out of habit, but out of memory, of travelers who never came home, of barns ransacked in the midnight hours. Even animals were not immune to the change night brought. Wolves came down from the hills when the sky blackened, drawn by hunger and the scent of livestock. A farmer might wake to silence in his field, and know, without needing to check, that a predator had come in the hours when all were sleeping. It's no surprise, then, that across Europe bells were rung at twilight, church bells, long and slow, signaling the coming of curfew. The word itself, from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. It was a reminder to smother the flames, to dim the lights, to prepare for darkness not just as a physical change, but as a spiritual shift. To cover the fire was not merely a precaution against flame. It was a way to signal to the unseen that the house was guarded, that no mischief should pass its threshold. And how strange it might feel to us now, the way medieval people treated light as something sacred, even medicinal. A candle flame was not wasted. It was preserved, coaxed to life only when truly needed. One candle might serve an entire family. Its light used sparingly, its wax pinched and recast, its wick trimmed with care. To lose one's only taper in the night was not just inconvenient, it could be terrifying. There were customs, too, surrounding the light and dark. In some places, people would not say another's name aloud after nightfall, for fear that spirits would hear and come in that person's place. Mirrors were covered, lest wandering souls mistake them for a doorway, and children were taught never to whistle in the dark, for it might call something listening from the woods. Yet despite the fear, there was also something deeply reflective about darkness, something intimate. Without distractions, the night offered a stillness that allowed thoughts to swell, prayers to deepen, and souls to stretch into quiet corners rarely touched in the light of day. It was no coincidence that monks prayed through the night matins, lauds, vigils chanting into the void, as if their voices might form a bridge across the darkness. And peasants, though they did not have the luxury of monasteries, still treated the night with a sort of gentle reverence. They prayed aloud in whispers before lying down, marking themselves with the sign of the cross, saying charms passed down from grandmothers long gone. Sleep, after all, was a kind of surrender, and to surrender in such a world, where so many dangers were known and unknown, required ritual. Even beds were made with care, not simply for comfort, but for protection. A broom might be placed across the threshold. A sprig of rosemary hung from the ceiling. The straw mattress itself might be arranged in a certain direction, head to the east, feet to the west, as if aligning with the natural movements of the sun might protect one's spirit as it wandered through dreams, and dreams, too, were part of this darkness. In the medieval mind, dreams were not meaningless echoes of the day. They were messages, omens, sometimes from angels, sometimes from demons. A vivid dream after midnight might be read like scripture. A dream that recurred was whispered to the village priest. Night was not just a passage of time. It was an opening, a veil drawn back, through which divine or devilish wisdom might slip. Even the architecture reflected this fear of night. Small windows, narrow doorways, heavy shutters. Towns were built with walls, gates locked before dusk. Lanterns were placed not for aesthetics, but for survival. In cities, watchmen were hired to walk the streets with staves and bells, calling out the hour and alerting the sleeping town to anything unusual. A cry in the night, a knock, a scream, even the bark of a dog, could ripple through narrow alleys like thunder, because no one cried out in the medieval night without cause. But fear was never the whole of it. For all the anxiety that came with the dark, there was also peace, a kind of ritualized surrender that grew out of necessity. People found ways to soothe themselves into rest. They told stories beside the hearth. They hummed lullabies with words too old to translate. They laid down beside each other, mothers with daughters, fathers with sons, entire families in one bed beneath one blanket. And in that closeness there was warmth, there was safety. Even as wind pressed at the shutters and unknown things rustled outside, some found comfort in routine, the exact folding of a tunic before bed, the cleaning of fingernails by firelight, the placement of shoes near the door just so. These were not idle habits, but anchors in a sea of shadows, each motion a spell, each action a tether between one's body and the approaching stillness of sleep. So when the last flame was pinched out with wetted fingers, when the only sounds left were the breathing of loved ones and the occasional pop from the hearthstones, the medieval mind didn't entirely relax, but it did accept. It entered the night with caution, yes, but also with a kind of grace, knowing the risks, trusting the rituals, and hoping, as they whispered one last prayer, that they would wake again in the light. Sunset signals rest, how the medieval world wound down with the setting sun. The medieval world kept time not by clocks, but by the sky. It watched the shadows grow long in the fields, the golden light stretch across the village rooftops, the soft hush settle over everything when the sun began its slow descent. And when the last of the daylight slipped behind the trees, it was as if the entire world exhaled together. For those who lived then, sunset was not simply a visual cue. It was a rhythm, a sacred signal. The moment the day released its grip, and the night began to settle gently across the land. There were no evening rushes, no trains to catch, no glowing screens prolonging the day. When the sun began to fade, people obeyed. The body knew it was time to wind down. There was no resistance to the fading light, only ritual. In farms and towns across the continent, people paused. Work ceased. Fields were emptied of their laborers, who dusted straw from their clothes and rubbed dirt from their hands. Shepherds gathered their flocks, their whistles echoing through the dusk, and shopkeepers snuffed their candles and drew their shutters closed with a satisfied thud. The town, so bustling in the hours of brightness, softened into itself like a book closing at the end of a chapter. Inside the home, the end of daylight marked the beginning of the quiet evening rites. The hearth was stoked one last time. Bread was broken. The final meal, often simple, was served before the darkness settled in fully. Pottage, perhaps, thick with grains and roots. A crust of dark rye dipped into warm broth. A wedge of cheese or a boiled egg. The food of rest, not of exertion. And as families ate, they spoke in lower tones. There was something about twilight that invited calm, as if raising one's voice might disturb the hush that was gently wrapping around the house. Candles were lit sparingly, one or two perhaps, their flames trembling against the deepening blue outside the windows. In noble homes, more might be used, an indulgent dozen flickering in silver holders, but even there, the light was still precious. Wax was expensive, tallow smelly and short-lived, and so shadows were welcomed in, allowed to spread across walls, stretching long limbs into corners and cloaking the familiar in a soft, uncertain veil. The peasantry, bound more directly to the land and its moods, found themselves more deeply attuned to the sun's rhythms. Their days began when the rooster called and ended when the horizon glowed orange and gold. They didn't resist this natural schedule. They flowed with it. When the fields went dark, so did their tools. When the cows grew restless and the chickens clustered in corners, they knew. It was time to clean hands in cool well water, time to gather in the one warm room of the house, time to watch the light go from the window and know that rest was drawing near. Children were often the first to yawn, their heads nodding near the hearth, soots, mudged faces half asleep even before the final story was told. These stories were often part of the nightly rhythm, spoken slowly, rhythmically, by mothers or grandmothers who had heard them 1,000 times before. Tales of saints and sinners, of clever foxes and wandering knights, not so much for entertainment as for comfort, familiar words wrapping around sleepy minds like a woolen blanket, and always, always, the sun slipping further away, sinking into memory as the sky darkened. People did not fear sunset itself, no. That came later with the thick black of midnight, but they respected it. They recognized it as the turning of a page, a threshold to be crossed with care. The world grew quieter with each minute after sundown. Dogs stopped barking. Laughter became a murmur. Hammers no longer rang against anvils. Even the animals seemed to know. This was the time for stillness. In towns, the ringing of the curfew bell signaled the true end of the day's activities. The bell was not loud or urgent, but slow, solemn, almost mournful. Its tones floated over cobbled streets and into shuttered windows, reminding citizens that it was time to cover their fires, lock their doors, and prepare for the long hours ahead. The curfew was both practical and symbolic. It protected against fire. Of course, wooden buildings were vulnerable, and an untended flame could devastate an entire town. But it also marked the spiritual closing of the day. The bell was a kind of benediction, a tolling of time that acknowledged the labor that had passed and ushered in the calm of night. And with that sound, the last preparations began. Wooden boards were slid across windows. Doors were bolted with heavy iron latches. Boots removed and placed neatly beside low beds or straw pallets. Clothes were folded with slow, practiced hands. Everything had a place. Everything had a rhythm. This was the slowing of life, the narrowing of focus, the shifting inward from the wide sky of the day to the small circle of warmth at the heart of the home. Those with servants gave instructions for the morning, knowing that the night might bring unexpected frost or storm. A candle was set by the bed, and often a rosary or small cross was placed within reach. Protection against both natural and unnatural disturbances. There were those who believed night opened doorways that dreams might carry messages, or that wandering souls might pass close to the world of the living. To sleep was to submit to these possibilities, and so one had to prepare accordingly. For many, this preparation included prayer, softly spoken words almost inaudible, muttered while kneeling beside a low cot or sitting upon the edge of a woolen blanket. Forgiveness was asked for the day's missteps, gratitude offered for the food eaten, the work completed, the laughter shared. In a world where life was uncertain and death never far, no day was taken for granted. And so each evening's ritual was not just about rest. It was about humility, about acknowledgement. The sun had set again, and one had lived to see it. And once the last candle was snuffed, and the coals of the hearth glowed faintly beneath their ash covering, the world fell quiet, truly quiet, so quiet that the creaking of the roof beams could sound like a whisper from another room. The shifting of a sleeping sibling could wake you. A distant owl might sound impossibly near, but this silence was not frightening, it was familiar. It was the music of a world gone to rest, the lullaby of fields and forests and stone cottages sleeping beneath the stars. Occasionally, someone might stir during the night. The concept of sleeping in one unbroken stretch was foreign to many medieval people. There was often a first sleep and a second sleep, with a quiet waking hour in between, but even that middle of the night moment was framed by the setting of the sun. It was the sun's departure that marked the beginning of the journey into rest, a journey shaped by habit, by faith, by the feel of wool against skin, and the sound of a distant bell tolling the hour. And so it went night after night, year after year, from castle to cottage, abbey to farmhouse. The sun would rise and people would labor beneath it, and then, slowly, it would dip beneath the earth, and the world would exhale. Torches lit, prayers whispered, fires covered, doors locked, and eyes slowly closing beneath the soft hush of twilight. It is hard to imagine, now, a world so governed by light. We flip switches and stretch our days into long, electric evenings. We ignore the sun, defy it even, as we type and scroll and shine artificial light into every corner of our lives. But in the medieval world, the sun was master and marker. Its departure was felt in the bones. It signaled not just the end of a workday, but the beginning of a sacred, slow, beautiful winding down. A return inward, a soft folding of the world into itself. And so, as we sit now in the flickering firelight of memory, let us imagine that fading sun. Let us picture the way it lit up the thatched rooftops one final time, the way it painted the sky in amber and rose, the way a mother might pause, bowl in hand, and watch it sink behind the trees, not with sorrow, not with fear, but with deep ancestral understanding. The day is done, the shadows are long, the house is warm, and rest has come. Bedtime prayers and holy charms, spiritual routines before sleep. As the medieval night gathered itself around walls of timber and stone, sleep was never entered into lightly. To sleep was to let go of the day, yes, but it was also to let go of control. For in sleep the soul was thought to drift, to wander, to hover in the balance between this world and the next. And so, bedtime was not simply about soft pillows and closed eyes. It was about preparation, protection. Petition? Before the hush of sleep, there came the whisper of prayer. Even the poorest cottage, with its single smoky room and rough woolen bedding, held space for sacred ritual. A child might kneel beside a straw mattress, their knees pressing into dirt floors softened by rushes. A mother might hold their hand, her fingers rough from work, as they both recited words older than memory. In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. These words, ancient, rhythmic, offered not just comfort but safety. In a world where illness struck without warning, where childbirth was perilous, and fevers burned without cure, each night might be one's last. And so the soul was handed over, night after night, in hope and humility. In more well-to-do households, the rituals took on added layers. The bed itself might be surrounded by symbols of divine protection. A crucifix carved from yew or oak hung just above the pillow, its arms outstretched in silent blessing. Rosaries were wound gently around fingers, or placed beneath the pillow, beads warmed by the heat of the skin. Psalms were whispered in Latin by those who could read, or, more often, memorized phonetically by those who couldn't. The rhythm of the words mattered more than their comprehension. It was the act of devotion, the sound of submission to the divine, that wrapped the sleeper like a second blanket. And always there was the sign of the cross, made slowly, reverently across chest and brow. It was a drawing down of protection, a marking of the self with invisible armor. Parents would cross their children's foreheads before tucking them in, murmuring blessings passed down through generations. God keep thee this night, and all the angels about thee. A simple phrase, perhaps, but said with sincerity. The weight of belief was woven into every word. In monasteries and abbeys, where the rhythm of the day was dictated by bells and scripture, the evening prayers were longer and more structured. Compline was the final office of the day, the last gathering before rest. Monks filed silently into candle-lit chapels, their voices rising and falling in unison like breath itself. They sang the words of Psalm 91. Qui habitat in adjutorio altissimi he, who dwells in the shelter of the Most High. It was a psalm of safety, of refuge from terror and pestilence, of angels guarding the faithful through the darkness. And then, after the last chant had faded into the stone, they returned to their cells in silence. No conversation, no candle, just stillness. Sleep approached like a sacred visitor, and no monk would meet it unprepared. But the prayers of the laity were often more intimate, personal, domestic, filled with daily gratitude and small worries. A blacksmith might ask for strong arms on the morrow. A mother might ask for milk to nourish a child. A farmer might beg for fair weather. Their words floated up through thatched roofs and vanished into the stars, joining the whispered devotions of thousands across fields and towns, castles and cottages, each voice small but part of a vast chorus, like candle flames flickering against the vast dome of night. Alongside prayers came charms, objects, and phrases that offered added layers of protection. Not always sanctioned by the church, these were the holdovers of older beliefs, quietly stitched into Christian practice like embroidery beneath the hem. A small pouch of herbs, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for peace, might be hung above a bed. A tiny scrap of parchment bearing a saint's name or the words of the Lord's Prayer might be tied around the wrist or tucked inside a pillow. Some homes placed bowls of water beneath the bed, a kind of spiritual trap for spirits that might slip in unnoticed. Iron objects were especially prized. A nail driven into the lintel above a sleeping space, a tiny horseshoe nailed beneath the bed frame. It was said that the devil feared iron, that spirits and fairies could not cross it, and so it was used not for construction, but for comfort, for spiritual defense in the softest, most vulnerable moments of the night. In certain parts of Europe, it was common to draw symbols on doorways at dusk. The initials CMB, for the three Magi Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, would be written in chalk above the door each Epiphany and left there throughout the year. They served as a prayer of protection, warding off misfortune and spiritual harm. Others traced small crosses on their shutters, or whispered the names of saints as they turned their keys. And then there were the prayers not said aloud, the ones kept deep in the heart. A knight lying alone in a draughty chamber, his sword leaned against the wall, might not speak, but he would think of his family far away, of sins not confessed, of battles yet to come. His prayer might be nothing more than a sigh, a breath released into the dark, but it was still a reaching upward, still a yearning for mercy, for peace. Children, especially, were surrounded by ritual. A mother might lull her baby with a charm, song, her voice low and rhythmic. Sleep, sleep, my little one, sleep. Jesus guards thy soul so deep. Angels stand by door and wall, watching thee if shadows fall. These songs were both lullaby and prayer, passed from one generation to the next like heirlooms of melody. They soothed the child, but they also calmed the singer, anchoring both to something larger than themselves, something ancient and unseen. And in that lull, just before the final candle was snuffed, people often reviewed their day in silence, not with judgment but with reflection. Whom had they wronged? What joy had they found? What pain still lingered? In this quiet moment the medieval soul met itself. Sleep was not yet arrived, but it stood close, watching, waiting. And the human heart, worn from toil and tangled with uncertainty, reached for something to hold on to. There was comfort in routine, the same words, the same gestures, the same charms and whispers and symbols. Repetition made the invisible feel real, made the dark feel less vast, and whether or not the prayers were answered, whether or not the charms truly worked, it didn't matter, not entirely. What mattered was the rhythm, the reverence, the feeling of having done what one could before surrendering to the unknown. And then came the final moment, the quiet hush. The candle dimmed, the prayer complete, the blanket pulled up to the chin. A body still, a breath slowed, a world narrowed to darkness, and the slow drift toward dreams. Above, the stars turned silently in the sky. Below, the faithful slept, wrapped not just in wool and straw, but in devotion, guarded not just by locked doors and hearth embers, but by belief, by hope, by the murmured echoes of prayers spoken to no one and to everyone. And in this world, steeped in silence and flickering shadow, sleep came softly, not as a thief, but as a visitor invited, welcomed in with reverent words, seated gently by the bedside, and trusted, once again, with the delicate task of carrying the soul through the long dark night, flickering candles and glowing hearths, the calming ambience of medieval lighting. Long before the sharp hum of electricity, before lamps could be summoned with a flick of a switch, there was the soft glow of flame. Candlelight, firelight, these were the keepers of the night, the companions of dreams. And in the medieval world, where shadows came early and the dark pressed heavily against window panes, light was not just illumination. It was life. It was warmth. It was the gentle hand that guided people toward sleep. Imagine a cottage, humble and earthen, its walls woven with wattle and daub, its roof of thatch still damp with dew from the evening air. Inside, the day is winding down. A single candle burns in the center of the room, placed on a wooden table worn smooth by generations of elbows and prayer. Its flame flickers gently, casting gold across coarse fabrics, polished pewter, and the pale curve of a sleeping child's cheek. The shadows move like living things, soft, slow, graceful. They climb the walls and fall again. This is not the sterile brightness of modern light. This is something warmer, more ancient, a quiet, living dance of shadow and fire. In the castles and manors of the noble born, the story was grander, but not so different in soul. Tall sconces lined the halls, their torches fed with thick oil or wax. Iron chandeliers swung gently from wooden beams, each arm crowned with a precious flame. The rooms of such houses glowed not with brilliance but with intimacy. Light clung to tapestries and gilded mirrors, glinting off silver goblets and the jeweled hilts of swords at rest. A lady might sit by the fire, embroidering with tired eyes, the needle glinting gold each time it passed through the cloth. A lord might read from a heavy book, the pages catching firelight in pools, his shadow stretching behind him like a ghost of the day. And at the heart of it all always was the hearth. The hearth was the anchor of the medieval home, the belly of the house, its source of nourishment and heat. At night it became something else entirely, a ritual space, a gentle sanctuary. The fire burned lower after supper, its earlier fury tamed into a soft and comforting glow. The logs hissed and popped, sending up sparks that spiraled like stars. Around it people gathered, not just for warmth, though warmth was part of it, but for presence, for communion. It was beside the hearth that stories were told. Secrets shared, lullabies hummed, the flames offered not just light but rhythm, a steady flicker that seemed to slow time itself. The act of tending the fire was quiet and meditative, a slow shift of the embers, a patient adding of logs. In wealthier homes, servants might perform these tasks, gliding quietly through darkened chambers with a taper held aloft. But in most houses, it was the hands of the family that fed the flames, father, mother, eldest child. To cover the fire at night was to offer a prayer in action. May the warmth remain, may the light return in the morning. Candles, too, were treated with reverence. They were not objects of convenience but of ceremony. Beeswax candles were costly, with their sweet scent and clear, steady glow. These were reserved for churches, for feast days, for the chambers of kings and queens. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were more common among the people. They burned faster, and they smelled faintly of the animals from which they came, but they gave light, and that was enough. To light a candle at night was not done without thought. One might light it to read, yes, but more often to pray, to watch, to wait. The flame itself was symbolic. The soul, the breath of life, the divine presence in a dark and unpredictable world. Many believed that to let a candle burn out unattended was bad luck. It was said that spirits might slip in with the smoke, or that the devil might snuff it to steal one's breath. And so the wick was trimmed, the flame fed, the wax gathered and saved for later use. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken for granted. Some households owned only a single candlestick. It would be moved carefully from room to room, its base warmed by the hand that carried it. The flame was sheltered from the breeze with a cupped palm or a bit of glass. The candle might be placed beside a bed while a child recited their nighttime prayers. Later, it would stand watch in the corner of the room, its glow the last companion before sleep. Its light wasn't bright enough to push the darkness away entirely, but it held the dark at bay. It carved out a little world of safety, a circle of peace, and then, of course, came the moment of extinguishing. This was not a careless act. It was deliberate, sometimes solemn. A clay snuffer lowered gently over the flame, a breath held, then blown in a soft, slow exhale, and as the light vanished, a faint curl of smoke rose, scenting the air with a memory of warmth. The room shifted, shadows deepened, sleep drew near. Many families had small rituals for this moment. A whispered blessing, a final glance around the room, a tightening of the blanket. For some, the sight of the last candle being extinguished was a signal to let go, to sink, to allow the body to soften and the breath to slow. Outside, the world was utterly dark. No street lamps, no glowing windows. Only starlight and the moon when she was full and kind. The quiet was vast. It folded around cottages like wool, pressing in close and still. But within that darkness, within that hush, a single glowing ember beneath the hearthstones or a single candle in a wall sconce gave a profound sense of protection, of presence, of connection to something larger. In monasteries, this reverence for light reached sacred dimensions. Candles were not only practical, they were symbolic, holy, ritualistic. Every vigil, every evening prayer, every mass was lit by candlelight. The flickering glow illuminated faces bowed in devotion, caught the edge of gold, leaf icons, and polished stone altars. Even in the stillest hours of the night, monks might rise to sing by torchlight, their chants rising like incense toward the heavens. And in churches across Europe, candles were offered not just for light, but for hope. A woman might light one for a sick child. A night for safe return. The flame became the prayer itself, living, warm, persistent. It flickered long after the supplicant had gone, whispering their hope into the silence. Yet in the home, even the humblest fire had its own sanctity. It connected the family not just to one another, but to every other home across the land. From the hills of Scotland to the plains of France, from German villages to Italian hamlets, the same ritual played out. The covering of coals, the lighting of candles, the soft murmur of voices. Winding down, the lights dimmed, and with them, the thoughts of the day softened into dreams. Some would sit beside the hearth long after the others had gone to bed, staring into the embers. The fire was a companion, warm, living, breathing with its own gentle rhythm. Stories passed from father to son beside those flames. Songs were sung, old hurts were remembered, grief soothed. The light of fire was never harsh. It did not accuse or demand. It simply flickered faithful, slow, hypnotic. Even today, there is something ancestral in our response to firelight. It draws us in, calms the nervous system, slows the heart. In the medieval world, it was not an aesthetic choice. It was survival, ritual, and intimacy. But the feeling was the same. That instinctive sense that in the presence of a flame we are safe, we are seen, we are home. And so the flickering candle and the glowing hearth were not just sources of light. They were the poetry of night. They were the bridge between wakefulness and sleep. The soul stepped quietly across them, cradled in warmth and ancient memory toward dreams. And somewhere, in the last quiet moment before sleep, with the last ember glowing red beneath its bed of ash, someone whispered a prayer, or nothing at all, and surrendered to the hush. The shared bed, family, servants, and strangers alike, sleep in the medieval world was rarely a private affair. Unlike our modern dreams of crisp sheets and solitary pillows, sleep then was communal, layered, and deeply intertwined with the architecture of necessity. To lie down at night was to do so not alone, but among the breathing, shifting presence of others. Family, servants, travelers, and sometimes even strangers, these were your bedtime companions, your fellow dreamers, each wrapped in wool and straw, and the rituals of nighttime rest. Picture a cottage nestled against the woods, its walls thick with clay and timber, its roof thatched and humming with the day's warmth. Inside, as the sun dips below the hills, the single room flickers with firelight. A mother rocks a baby at her chest. Two older children whisper together on a narrow bench, their voices hushed and dreamy. A father sharpens a blade, not for battle, but for work. His hands methodical, his mind already half asleep. And beside the hearth, stretched out upon a mattress of straw and stitched linen, the family's shared bed awaits. It was not a bed in the sense we know it now. It was often little more than a large pile of softened rushes or bundles of straw, covered with worn textiles, blank. It's made of wool, patched linen, or the hides of animals that once walked the same village paths. Over time, the bedding would be refilled and reshaped, layers added or removed depending on the season. In wealthier homes, a wooden frame might lift the sleeper from the cold stone floor. But for the common folk, the bed was often laid directly on the earth, close to the fire, and closer still to those you lived beside. There was warmth in togetherness, and warmth was no small matter. Winters in medieval Europe were cold, the kind of cold that crept beneath the door, wrapped itself around your ankles, and whispered into your bones. A fire could warm the room, yes, but it was the heat of bodies, layered beside one another beneath heavy quilts and shared cloaks, that truly held the chill at bay. Infants nestled between their parents, toddlers curled into the curve of an older sibling's back. It wasn't about space, it was about survival. But more than warmth, it was also about closeness, about the rhythm of breath shared in sleep. A child drifting off with a mother's arm draped loosely over their side. A father, weary from the fields, snoring gently as his feet tangle with those of his youngest. Whispered prayers, quiet giggles, the occasional scolding hush. All of it a nightly tapestry woven not with fabric, but with presence. And this arrangement wasn't limited to the nuclear family. In small homes, servants slept near the family they served, often in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed. A young maid might sleep at the foot of the master's bed, her dreams shared in the same hush of candlelight. A stable boy, exhausted from the day's labor, might lie near the door, a thick blanket his only shield from the cold stone beneath. The lines between servant and kin were blurred at bedtime, at least in proximity, if not always in comfort. In noble houses, the beds were grander, their canopies heavy with embroidered cloth, the mattresses filled with feathers rather than straw. But even here, solitude was rare. Ladies in waiting often slept in the same chamber as the lady of the house. Children were rarely placed in nurseries. Instead, they slept near their wet nurses or close to their parents. Even kings and queens shared their sleeping spaces with guards, companions, or scribes on rotation. Privacy, as we know it, was an illusion not sought, and certainly not expected. Traveling was perhaps the most intimate testament to this shared nature of sleep. Inns and guest houses were few, and beds were fewer still. A weary traveler might pay for a place not in a room, but in a bed already occupied. It was not uncommon for 2 or 3 strangers to sleep side by side back to back, or shoulder to shoulder beneath one blanket, warming one another with nothing more than proximity. The arrangement was practical, it was temporary, and it was accepted with the kind of quiet resignation known only to those who have walked all day and have nowhere else to go. Sometimes these arrangements sparked conversations. 2 men in a roadside inn might murmur stories in the dark of distant wars, lost loves, the shape of clouds in foreign skies. Or they might not speak at all, instead letting the shared breath and steady silence stretch between them like a blanket of its own. The intimacy of sleep, even among strangers, created a kind of unspoken peace. For those few hours, the bed was neutral ground. Of course, not all shared beds were so peaceful. Children kicked, adults snored. Someone always claimed more blanket than their share. And in every home there was that nightly ritual of negotiating who lay where. The youngest pressed to the warmest middle. The eldest allowed the edge. Pets sometimes curled near the foot, especially in winter, providing additional warmth and a comforting weight against wandering dreams. There were also deeper tensions. The shared bed could not hide family disagreements, marital friction, or the silent sorrow of grief. A husband lying with his back to his wife, a mother weeping silently after burying a child. The bed saw all, heard all. It was not simply a place for rest. It was a repository of emotion, of life lived fully, and without the pretenses afforded by modern doors and private spaces. And yet, in the humbleness of this closeness, there was something beautifully human, something grounding, something that tethered people not just to each other, but to time itself. The sleep they shared was not just about recovery, it was about connection. When you sleep beside someone, you surrender your defenses. You drift into the unknown, trusting that those beside you will remain, that the fire will keep burning, that the night will pass safely. In some homes, the bed was more than a resting place. It was a site of storytelling, of laughter, of whispered teachings. Parents told tales from scripture or legend while the children drifted off. Grandparents recited poems from memory. Siblings shared secrets beneath the same blanket, giggling into the straws. Stuffed silence. The shared bed was a cradle of culture, a hearth of the mind as much as of the body. At times, births happened in that same bed. So, too, did deaths. A grandmother might pass away with her daughter beside her. Her grandchildren curled at her feet, unaware of the passage unfolding. The bed bore witness to both the first breath and the last, with every night between laced with dreams that blurred the line between life and something more mysterious. Even illness was not quarantined away. A coughing child remained in the bed. A fevered parent, too. There was danger, of course disease could move quickly through shared quarters, but what alternative was there? And so they cared for one another, cool cloths on burning foreheads, sips of broth in the dark, a hand grasped beneath the covers. It was through this nightly closeness that a kind of unshakable empathy was formed. Sleep was not solitary. Healing was not solitary. Life, even in its quietest moments, was collective, and so the medieval bed, shared, narrow, straw, filled or feather, stuffed, was never just a place to lie down. It was the gentle cradle of human experience, holding the weight of bodies, of dreams, of moments between waking and sleeping that would never be spoken of in daylight again. Now, in our own time, we have grown used to solitude. We stretch across mattresses built for two, with no one there. We pull the blanket over ourselves alone. But in that deep, ancestral place within us, there may still be a memory, a longing for the murmur of others, the warmth of shared breath, the comforting rustle of someone else turning beside you in the night. In the medieval world, this was not a longing. It was life. Night after night, the bed welcomed not one, but many. Not silence, but the soft symphony of sleep shared in common. And in that closeness there was comfort. Not always rest, not always ease, but always, always connection. So let us imagine that old bed now. Straw rustling softly beneath linen. A candle guttering low in the corner. The fire casting one last golden breath before sinking to ember. And beside you, family, companions, strangers, the world quiet now, not alone, never alone, just softly, slowly, drifting into the long hush of sleep. The bedtime prayers and chants murmured by firelight. The fire had begun to dim. Its orange glow receded into soft coils of amber, whispering against stone and clay walls. Shadows lengthened across the thatched ceiling as the embers settled in, crackling like distant rain. In that quiet hour between supper and slumber, voices softened, movements slowed, and the whole household bent gently toward the same nightly ritual, prayer. Bedtime in the medieval world was not only the end of labor. It was a return to the sacred. The day's noise fell away, and with it came the hush of reverence. Candles flickered on wooden tables, their wax melting in slow rivulets. Knees met floorboards, hands clasped instinctively. And into the silence came the first murmur of words not shouted, not even spoken clearly, but whispered, reverent, almost like the sound of breath itself. These prayers, learned young and repeated nightly, were anchors in the drifting sea of medieval life. The world was uncertain. War, famine, plague, and sin loomed always, but the act of prayer, especially at day's end, was something solid, something known. Whether one was a noblewoman in a stone chamber, or a farmhand in a straw-filled loft, the language of these murmured invocations wove its way through every level of society. It didn't matter if you were literate. The words were in your blood. Ave Maria, Pater Noster. The prayers were most often in Latin, the sacred language of the Church. Though in homes where Latin was not understood, people still learned the rhythms, the syllables, the breath of the words. It was the repetition that mattered, the cadence, the sound. Over time, the meaning lived not in translation, but in tradition. A child could recite the words without knowing their exact purpose, only that they were holy, protective, necessary, In many households, the evening began with the sign of the cross, forehead, chest, shoulder to shoulder, and then the soft cascade of the Lord's Prayer. Pater Noster, quies in caelis, the syllables hung in the air, like incense, warm and ancient. Parents would say it aloud, slowly, while the children followed just behind, mimicking the words, letting the sound guide them as twilight deepened. Sometimes these prayers were spoken at the hearth, the warmest and brightest place in the home. The fire, still glowing from the evening meal, would become a kind of altar. Around it gathered all who could, children with sleepy eyes, elders wrapped in woolen shawls, even servants who paused their labors just long enough to kneel beside the rest. There were no pews, no stained glass, just earth and stone and flickering flame, and in that humble space heaven felt close. The content of the prayers often reflected the fears and hopes of the night. There was a certain vulnerability in sleep, a letting go that felt risky in a world full of devils, spirits, and unseen dangers. And so people prayed not just for peace, but for protection. They prayed that no evil would enter the room, that the soul would be guarded in its wandering, that they would wake in the morning unharmed. To many, sleep was a kind of death, and waking a small resurrection. Each night carried that gentle uncertainty. Would the sun rise again for you? Would your heart still beat when the rooster crowed? And so, prayers often included a plea for mercy. If I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. That line, so familiar even now, was once more than rhyme. It was a quiet shield, a whispered hope spoken beneath beams and thatch. In wealthier households, the rituals became more elaborate. Books of hours, illuminated with delicate saints and curling vines, were brought out at dusk. These books guided the prayers, marking specific times for each devotion, matins, compline, vespers. A noblewoman might read aloud from such a book, her voice blending with the rustle of her gown, the flutter of page against candlelit desk. Servants nearby would listen, joining in where they could, repeating familiar refrains, their Latin coarse but heartfelt. In monasteries and convents, the night prayers were more structured still. The monks and nuns would gather in candlelit chapels, their voices rising in chant. Gregorian tones, low, solemn, meditative, would swell and echo off stone. Salve Regina Kyrie eleison, the sound was less like song, more like breathing turned sacred. And though few in the countryside ever heard such music in person, many had a sense of it, learned from traveling priests, from church holidays, from whispered imitation. For the common folk it was simpler, perhaps a fragment of Psalm 4, "In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety," or a prayer to Saint Michael, protector of souls in the night. Children were taught to call upon their guardian angels, believed to hover nearby, watching, waiting, guiding unseen. Some even left small offerings on bedside tables, a crust of bread, a flower, a carved cross, to ward off spirits or please the watching saints. And there were chants too, not grand hymns, but soft, almost lullaby, like refrains, short lines repeated gently again and again, sometimes sung, sometimes murmured. A mother might rock her child and hum, Jesu dulcis memoria, over and over until the child's breathing slowed and the shadows took on a friendly hush. These chants became bridges between day and dream, sacred and safe. For those who could not sleep, the prayers continued longer. A widow, lying alone, might whisper rosary after rosary, the beads slipping through her fingers like hours. A sick child's parents might take turns praying through the night, their voices strained but steady. Even those away from home, soldiers, pilgrims, shepherds, might look to the stars and say the same words they'd spoken every night since childhood. A tether back to hearth and home. Superstition, too, wound its way into prayer. Some people recited charms prayers laced with older, pre-Christian protections. A whispered line to keep the fairies away. A rhyme said while tying the bed, curtain. In northern villages, some families would sprinkle salt in the corners of the room while reciting a verse from Matthew. In others, Iron was laid at the threshold, and the Lord's Prayer was spoken backward, not to blaspheme, but to confuse the devil, who was said to wander after midnight. The candle, too, played a role. Lighting it was a sacred gesture. Extinguishing it, often done after the last word of prayer, was symbolic. The flame went out, and the house returned to darkness. But in the mind the light remained, the memory of prayer, the shelter of those whispered words, like an unseen cloak drawn tight across the shoulders of sleep. And then came the silence, the long, deep quiet of night. The prayers had ended, the chants had faded. The hearth had dimmed to ember, but in that silence was not emptiness, it was fullness, a fullness of hope, of safety, of sacred trust. The room might be shared, the bedding course, but the soul was wrapped in something eternal. In that stillness dreams came gently, not always peaceful. This was a world steeped in signs and symbols, but familiar. The saints visited some, angels others. A mother dreamt of a child growing tall. A boy dreamt of a white stag in a sunlit forest. And if nightmares came, the prayers remained like talismans, pressed against the heart, even in sleep. Morning would come, the rooster's call, the stir of feet on floor, and with it new prayers, this time of thanks. But in the night, beneath beams and stars and roof tiles, it was the bedtime prayers that mattered most. Words passed down through generations, words spoken half asleep, half in faith, wholly in hope. They are mostly forgotten now, these murmured rituals, replaced with silent screens and hurried bedtimes. But somewhere in the softest corners of memory they linger. The warmth of the fire, the candle's final flicker, the ancient rhythm of words whispered into darkness. And perhaps, just perhaps, in your own twilight hour, as your thoughts grow soft and your breathing slows, you might feel them return. Not in Latin, not even in prayer, but in the quiet, in the stillness, in the sacred hush before sleep. Why people feared sleep as a passage to another world? The fire had long since settled into a low, glowing hush. A soft wind touched the wooden shutters, and the sound of distant owls echoed faintly across the fields. Beneath layers of wool and linen, within timber-framed homes, people were finally drifting towards sleep. But even in the comfort of beds warmed by embers and family breath, sleep was never taken lightly. For many in the medieval world, sleep was not a gift, not merely a pause from labor. It was something stranger, something deeper. It was a doorway, a narrow and trembling passage to somewhere else. To sleep, they believed, was to surrender the soul, not just figuratively, but literally. While the body remained on earth still, breathing, vulnerable, the soul was thought to travel, outward, upward, into realms unknown. And though the idea might seem distant now, back then, it was a fear as familiar as the cold. In those hours after nightfall, when the last candle was pinched and the darkness pressed close, the mind was susceptible to visitations. Not all of them kind. Dreams weren't whimsical things to share over breakfast. They were omens, warnings. Sometimes divine, sometimes infernal. A dream could mean your crops would fail, or that a loved one was in danger. It could be a message from a saint, wrapped in light, or a trap set by a demon, cloaked in false visions. You never truly knew. This is why sleep was not entered without preparation, not simply a blanket and a yawn, but a ritual, a spiritual readiness. Prayers were whispered with urgency. Crosses were traced over pillows. A splash of holy water might be sprinkled across the bed, just in case. Because while the soul roamed, the body remained behind, and anything could creep in. The fear wasn't merely metaphorical. The boundary between waking and dreaming was thought to be porous, thin. It was said that witches could invade your dreams, planting illusions or draining your strength while you slumbered. There were tales passed from mouth to mouth, of people who had gone to bed perfectly well and woke up broken, shivering, or changed somehow, as though they'd seen something they couldn't explain, or been seen. And then there were the spirits. Some whispered of the mare, a nocturnal demon who would sit upon the chest of sleepers, suffocating them slowly in their dreams. The word nightmare itself traces back to this old fear. It wasn't just a bad dream, it was a visitation. A presence, a weight pressing into your ribs, heavy as sin, dark as sorrow. To suffer it once was frightening. To suffer it repeatedly could lead to sleeplessness, madness, or worse. Others spoke of the Fae, the old spirits of hill and hollow, the fair folk whose mischief at night was more than harmless play. They were said to lure dreamers into their world, beautiful, yes, but treacherous, if one fell too deep into dream, too far from the waking world. The soul might never return. The body would remain, eyes closed, breath faint, but the spirit would be dancing forever in the hills beneath the moon, lost in a glamour never meant for mortal minds. To guard against these dangers, charms were kept close. A simple iron nail beneath the bed, a small crucifix tucked into the mattress stuffing, a protective word etched above the door frame, invisible to most, visible only to those who needed it. These were not superstitions to be scoffed at. They were safeguards, lifelines. Sleep was also feared for its resemblance to death. The body stilled, the breath slowed, the silence was absolute. It was not uncommon for someone to die in their sleep, with no warning, no cry, no sign, just a stillness that would not lift come morning. And because of this, there was always a moment of hesitation before the final candle was blown out. A breath held, a silent question, will I wake again? Even the Church, in its great wisdom and ritual, did not dismiss these fears. Clerics spoke of the soul's journey through sleep, of angels guiding the pure-hearted safely through the veil of night. But they also warned of demons waiting along the path, trials in dream where one's character might be tested even while the body lay limp and unknowing. A man could sin in his sleep. A woman could fall prey to temptation and never even know it. To dream impurely was to open the soul to corruption. So they were taught to keep their minds clean, their thoughts orderly, their hearts vigilant even in sleep. Monks and nuns would sometimes bind themselves to a particular phrase of Scripture, repeating it over and over as they drifted off, hoping to shield their subconscious from temptation. Lay people, less trained in such practices, clung to what they knew: family prayers, the names of saints, the image of Christ crucified, anything to anchor the soul, to tether it to goodness as it wandered through the unlit corridors of the night. But not all dream. Travel was feared. Some dreams were seen as gifts. A farmer might wake and know where to dig his next well. A young woman might dream of a future husband's face. A mother might feel her child's soul brushing against her own, offering comfort or farewell. The mystics, those blessed and strange few, believed sleep was when God whispered most clearly. Wrapped in silence, the soul could finally listen. These dreams were cherished, written down if possible, passed along to priests or healers. A good dream could become prophecy, a bad one a warning. A repeating dream, especially one filled with symbols or sacred creatures, was considered vital. If you dreamed of birds, what kind? Were they black or white or bleeding? If you saw a river, was it calm or rushing? If you saw yourself, were you alive or dead? It's easy now to dismiss such questions, but back then they carried weight. Life was mysterious, uncertain, and often brutal. Dreams were a rare source of clarity, or at least the illusion of it. In a world without clocks, without hospitals, without the security of modern light, the dream was one of the few ways the divine might touch the human mind. And so, people feared sleep, but they also longed for it. A kind sleep could be healing, even holy. A harsh one could wound as deeply as war, and both were outside the dreamer's control. Some turned to herbal aids, lavender tucked into linen, chamomile brewed in steaming mugs, valerian root hung above the bed. not just for comfort, but for guidance. These herbs were said to calm the spirit, to ease the passage from wakefulness to slumber. But they were also used to steer dreams, to encourage visions of loved ones, or to open the soul's ear to angelic voices. The right herb in the right dose might lead to an answer long prayed for, or it might invite something in that was never meant to enter. There are accounts of dream fasting, a practice where a person would go without food or speak only in prayer for a day before sleeping, hoping for a divine message. Others might sleep beside a relic or inside a church, especially on feast days, when the veil between worlds was thought to thin. These were not casual acts. They were bold steps into the unknown, a request, an opening, and always, always, the uncertainty. Would the dream come? Would it be kind? Would it be real? When people spoke of such things in daylight, they did so cautiously. Over bread, over spinning wheels and plowshares, a glimmer in the eye, a lowered voice, not quite ashamed, but not entirely comfortable either. Dreams were too strange, too wild to speak of boldly, but they mattered. In their own quiet way, they shaped the path ahead. And so each night the fire would dim, the world would hush, and people, wrapped in blankets and prayer, would step again into the passage of sleep. Uncertain, afraid, hopeful. Some would wake unchanged, some would wake wiser, a few would not wake at all. But all of them, whether in castle or cottage, shared that same breathless moment between light and dark, where sleep beckoned and the soul stood at the threshold. And you, lying now in the hush of your own room, may not fear sleep in quite the same way, but listen to the quiet, to the stillness, to the hush that holds more than silence. Perhaps the medieval mind wasn't so wrong. Perhaps sleep really is a journey, and perhaps, just perhaps, there is still magic in its mystery. Now let your own breathing slow. Let the echoes of the fire fade, and allow your spirit to rest. The passage awaits. The strange medical beliefs surrounding night air and its dangers. There was something uncanny about the night air in medieval times. It was not simply a lack of light that worried people once the sun had dropped behind the hills, nor just the unknown sounds that stirred in the hedgerows and behind barn doors. It was the very air itself, the unseen breath of the world after dark, that stirred the imagination and, more importantly, stirred fear. The night air, they believed, could make you ill, not metaphorically ill, not emotionally troubled, but truly, physically sick, as surely as any poisoned cup or bite of spoiled meat. This belief was not limited to a few superstitious villagers or isolated hamlets. It stretched across Europe, whispered from the lips of physicians and peasants alike, nestled deep into the folds of medical thought inherited from the ancients. The doctrine of humors, dominant for centuries, taught that the body's balance could be thrown off by all manner of environmental shifts, and nothing unbalanced the humors more mysteriously than the damp, heavy, unseen quality of night air. It wasn't just the chill of a breeze that stirred anxiety. It was the idea that, once the sun set, the very nature of the air changed. During the day, air was animated by warmth and life. At night, it turned stagnant, corrupted, carried with it unseen vapors and miasmas, those invisible clouds of foulness thought to arise from swamps, refuse, or simply the damp ground itself. When darkness fell, these invisible poisons crept through cracks in shutters, slithered beneath doors, and wrapped themselves around the sleeper's nose and mouth. To lie in a draught was a dangerous thing. To fall asleep with an open window, unthinkable, for the air, they believed, could settle in your lungs while you lay helpless. It could invade you, quietly, patiently, and come morning, you'd rise with chills, a fever, or worse. A wasting illness, one that would gnaw at the flesh or cloud the mind. Travelers on long roads would hurry to reach shelter by dusk. Doors were closed early, curtains were drawn, not only to keep out the wind or prowlers, but to ward off the air itself. In castles and cottages alike, rushes were laid thickly on floors to absorb the night's moisture. Herb bundles were hung above beds not only for their pleasant scent, but because people believed they could purify the air, ward off the bad humors that floated invisibly through darkened halls. Even physicians of the era, learned in the texts of Galen and Hippocrates, warned their patients to avoid exposure after sunset. They recommended covering the head while sleeping, wrapping the body tightly, sealing off any paths through which the noxious air might find its way. There were long treatises written about the dangers of sleeping near marshland, or in low-lying places where foul vapors collected. A person who lived too near a stagnant pond might be fine by day, but wither away in their sleep, they said, taken slowly by the rot of the air. In cities it was even worse. The filth of the streets, the endless dung heaps and slaughterhouse runoff, combined with the stillness of nighttime to create an air so feared it was thought capable of causing plague. When outbreaks did occur, and they often did, it was the air that was blamed, not rats, not fleas, but the quality of the air itself. And so, at night, people stuffed cloth soaked in vinegar into their nostrils. They burned herb sage, rosemary, time hoping to chase away the bad air with sweeter smoke. Chimneys were prized not just for their warmth, but for their ability to vent out dangerous fumes. And even the poor, those without stone hearths or tiled roofs, did what they could, hanging charms, lighting candles, whispering protective prayers, anything to keep the foul air from stealing in while they slept. Some towns imposed curfews not only to keep order, but to limit nighttime movement and, by extension, exposure. Lanterns were carried low to the ground to avoid stirring up miasmas from the cobbled streets. And it wasn't unusual for people to wake through the night just to relight incense or throw another pinch of herbs into the fire, creating what they hoped would be a protective barrier against the unseen. Of course, there were always skeptics. A few brave, or perhaps foolish souls insisted that fresh air, even at night, could be healthy. They'd leave windows cracked open and sleep uncovered, but more often than not, if those individuals fell ill, their neighbors would point with grim satisfaction and say, "See, the air took them." There were strange contradictions, too. While the air was feared, some forms of night vapor were oddly welcomed. Steam baths taken before bed were thought to purge the body of bad humors and protect against night air's more sinister forms. People would steep themselves in hot water, breathing deeply of the scented steam, then race to bed to trap the warmth around their bodies before any cold draught could undo the effect. In certain monasteries, monks were instructed to wear nightcaps even in warm months, to prevent the descending vapors from entering the head and disturbing sleep or sanity. Sleepwalking, too, was blamed on night air, along with nightmares, nosebleeds, and bouts of madness. If someone muttered strangely in their sleep, it was often said that the air had reached their brain. And then, of course, there were the superstitions, stories told by grandmothers in flickering firelight. That night air carried spirits, that ghosts moved through it like fish through water, that a single breath of it, at the wrong moment, could carry in not just illness but the whisper of something unearthly. A curse, a memory, a soul not yet at rest. It was said that if you stood in a graveyard too long after sunset and breathed too deeply, the dead might follow you home, riding in on your breath. So windows were closed, doors barred, and the air inside was made thick with smoke and warmth, not always pleasant, but safer than what lay beyond the walls. Of course, as time marched on, these fears evolved. By the later medieval period, some doctors began to question the extremes, but even so, most households still treated the night as an invisible adversary. Caution had become custom. Entire generations were taught to fear what they could not see, but were certain could harm them. It's strange to think, now, in our modern age of open windows and night breezes, of just how deeply these fears were felt, how serious the warnings, And yet, in a world without electric lights, without microscopes, without antibiotics or germ theory, the air was a mystery, and mystery breeds caution. To sleep was to submit to that mystery, and so people wrapped themselves tightly, breathed through herbs, prayed silently, and lay as still as possible, lest they draw the attention of something hovering just beyond the darkened rafters. Now, as you breathe in and out, safely tucked in your own space, you may smile at the thought. Night air flows freely through modern homes, untroubled, unnoticed. But somewhere, faintly, in the inherited corners of memory, that old caution lingers. A whisper that reminds us the dark still holds its own quiet power. A power not to fear, but to respect. And as the night settles gently around you, you might find peace in the knowledge that we have come so far, and yet still find wonder in what the darkness once held. Sleep now, the air is still. The fears are long gone, but the hush of night remains soft as breath, gentle as a forgotten prayer, candlelight and fire as protective forces against the dark. There is a hush that settles over a medieval home as the last rays of sunlight slip away, and the cold breath of night begins to rise from the earth. It is the hush of a world grown dark without resistance, a world where electricity does not answer your touch, where no switch waits at the wall, where the stars are the only glitter in the ceiling. Above, in such a world, night was a thing to be acknowledged, tamed, perhaps even appeased, and so people turned to flame. The lighting of candles and fires at nightfall was more than convenience. It was more than just warmth for the body or light for the eye. It was ritual, sacred, a ward against the invisible things that crept with the dusk. For to the medieval mind, the dark was not merely an absence of light. It was a presence in itself, a lurking thing, a carrier of spirits, illnesses, accidents, and whispers that could chill the blood. And in this ever-watchful darkness, fire became something like a friend or a sentry. A hearth in the evening was the soul of the home, the crackle of logs, the soft flicker of flame against stone, the way the light danced across rough, hewn timbers and familiar faces. It was comfort. It was survival, not just physically, though the fire kept biting winter winds at bay and dried damp clothes after long rains, but spiritually. Emotionally, the fire was a gathering place, a buffer against the terrifying vastness of the night beyond those walls. Children learned to love the fire not only for its warmth, but for its safety. Stories were told beside it, tales of saints and monsters, of brave deeds and long forgotten kings. And always those stories lived in contrast to the dark. The candlelight made the tales more vivid, the shadows more mysterious, the warmth more necessary. There were rules, unspoken and spoken, about keeping the fire alive through the night. Letting it die entirely was unlucky. Dangerous. Some said it was an invitation to spirits. Others whispered that a fire left to die alone might carry your dreams away with its smoke. A smoldering hearth could be gently banked, its coals tucked beneath ash like a sleeper beneath wool, ready to wake again in the morning. But it should never be extinguished with haste or disrespect. Fire was too sacred for that. Candles, too, had their place. Though dear and not used frivolously, they were brought out with care when the sun's light had fully faded. Each one was like a prayer against the dark, a little star you could carry in your hand. The act of lighting a candle was often accompanied by a quiet word, a murmured invocation sometimes to saints, sometimes to the Virgin, and sometimes simply to the light itself. And light, in those hours, was more than utility. It was protection. A lit candle in the window might signal a welcome to travelers, or it might be a ward against those who should not come near. In times of illness or mourning, candles were lit to guide the spirit of the sick, or departed safely to the next world. And during childbirth, candles were kept burning beside the laboring mother, to drive away evil forces that preyed on women in their most vulnerable hour. In monasteries, candlelight was a constant rhythm of life, The hours were kept not by clocks but by bells, by prayers, and by the slow burning of wax. In the silence of those ancient cloisters, monks would rise in the pitch of night for matins, guided only by candlelight through stone corridors echoing with chants and footfalls. The flame was not just light, it was devotion. Even among the poor, where candles were a luxury, they were treated with reverence. Tallow dips, roughly made and uneven in their glow, still carried weight beyond their humble flicker. People believed that a candle snuffing itself out suddenly, without breeze or touch, was a bad omen, that a sputtering flame might mean a spirit had passed through. Some would stare into the flame as they drifted into sleep, letting its light blur until it became a single glowing point, something to focus on, something to carry into dreams. In households that could afford them, lanterns were placed near doorways and beds, their glass sides fogged with breath and soot. Some were carved with religious symbols, crosses, fish, lilies, so that even their glow spoke of safety and faith. In dark, timbered halls, sconces lined the walls with beeswax candles lit for evening prayers or quiet reflection, their melted wax trailing like teardrops down blackened iron. Superstition and belief gave the flame more meaning than mere brightness. It was said that fire, like God, could see and know. That if a person told a lie in firelight, the flame would flicker or lean away. That if a candle burned low and the wax ran uneven, it meant someone in the household would fall ill. That staring too long into the fire could summon visions or madness. And yet, despite this reverence, there was familiarity too, a comforting domesticity to flame. The woman of the house might whisper to the fire as she stirred the pot above it, asking it to cook evenly or to forgive her for the lack of meat in the stew. The man tending the hearth might talk to it under his breath while poking embers, treating it not as tool but as old friend. A dog might curl beside it with a sigh. A child might fall asleep watching the flame, imagining it danced just for them. There was also an intimacy to firelight that few modern lights can match. It softened the world. It hid harsh lines. It turned a simple wooden bowl into something glowing and precious, or made a calloused hand seem tender. Lovers spoke quietly beside it. Parents rocked infants by it. Priests gave last rites in its glow, and so the flame bore witness to lives from beginning to end. And then there was the sacred fire, the paschal flame at Easter, the Advent candles in the church, the votive lights before saints' images. These were not just lights in the dark, they were lights of the dark, lights born for the purpose of transforming darkness into meaning. And people believed that even the tiniest candle, burning with sincerity, could banish fear, could defy evil, could speak to heaven on cold winter nights, when frost clawed at the shutters and wind howled down the chimney. The fire inside was more than heat. It was defiance, it was hope. Outside the woods might be full of things, wolves, spirits, or just the bitter quiet of a world too vast. But inside there was light, flickering, warm, faithful. Sometimes, as they lay in their beds beneath layers of linen, wool, and fur, people would leave the last candle burning as long as they dared, watching its little flame dance and gutter, holding onto the light just a bit longer before surrendering to sleep, not because they feared sleep itself, but because letting the last candle go out meant placing all trust in the silence. In the dark, in the fire's promise to return, and so each night a quiet ritual, the stoking of the hearth, the lighting of a taper, the blessing of the bed, the careful extinguishing of one flame and the preserving of another. And with that, sleep could come, slow, gentle, wrapped in shadows that no longer seemed so threatening, because just beyond them glowed the ever-watchful flame. Tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine that ancient glow. Imagine the warmth of the hearth against your cheek, the soft crackle of wood, the slow melting of wax, the way a flickering flame makes even the darkest corners feel less vast. The flame does not fear the dark. It keeps watch patiently, lovingly, just as it did centuries ago for all those who, like you, were simply looking for peace in the quiet hush of night. Rest now, and let the fire keep you company, as it always has. Prayers to saints and angels before sleep. The day has long since fallen into silence. The hearth flickers low now, its light reduced to a gentle amber blush across the walls. Outside the wind has begun its quiet hum, pressing against wooden shutters with a slow persistence, like the breath of the world itself exhaling. The medieval night, for all its darkness, was rarely met with fear because it was met with prayer. Before sleep came, the soul had to be prepared, not just for dreams, but for the darkness itself. For the medieval mind, every evening was a small rehearsal for death. Not in fear, but in reverence. One never knew if they would wake again. And so the body might lie down with fatigue, but the spirit must be tucked in just as carefully, swaddled in words older than memory, offered up to saints and angels who hovered just beyond the veil. Even the poorest cottager might murmur a familiar rhyme into the straws, stuffed pillow. Even the cloistered monk, already soaked in scripture and ritual, would pause before sleep to offer final petitions. And in the highest halls of the nobility, where beds were carved of oak and draped in velvet, prayers still curled softly through the air like incense from a chapel altar. There was one prayer above all others spoken in thousands of households, whispered by countless voices for centuries. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed that I lie on. It was a simple invocation, easy on the tongue, made sacred through repetition. Each name a shield, each syllable a gesture of spiritual comfort. It was not theological sophistication, it was closeness. A reminder that even as one drifted into unconsciousness, the saints stood vigil. And what better companions for sleep than saints? They were guardians, after all, each one assigned to their task, their virtue, their little corner of the vast spiritual realm. Children prayed to St. Nicholas or St. Anne, their little hands clasped beneath patchwork quilts. Mothers might call on the Virgin Mary for protection over their infants, especially in homes where death in the night was always a possibility, quiet and unseen. Fathers would whisper to St. Joseph for strength to face another day's labor, and to St. Michael to guard the house from harm. St. Michael, the warrior, he who held a flaming sword, to the medieval sleeper, Michael was more than an abstract figure. He was the very gatekeeper of the night. Some believed he patrolled the skies as darkness fell, his wings spread wide, his armor shining with divine light. Others imagined him standing silent at the foot of the bed, like a knight guarding the threshold between waking and dreaming. Children especially found comfort in the angels, not the majestic seraphim of Scripture, too vast and terrifying for the mind to hold, but the soft, warm angels of bedtime stories. Guardian angels, personal, gentle, invisible companions who could see the monsters that lurked in shadows and knew the right words to hush them away. Before sleep, children were taught to say, "Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here. Ever this night be at my side, to light and guard, to rule and guide." The rhyme was simple, but its rhythm, its repetition, and its promise gave power. A holy watchman would stand over them as they slept. What could be more soothing than that? In monasteries, the final service of the day was called Compline. The night prayer. After the long rhythm of work, prayer, and study, the monks would process in silence, candles flickering as shadows arched across stone walls. They would chant the psalms softly, the last words of the day falling into the sacred stillness like falling petals. And then the last bell would toll, the great doors would close, and the monks would enter their cells, resting in silence beneath the protective wings of divine sleep. In castles and manors, the noble might have their chaplain read scripture aloud before bed, or they might kneel briefly on cold floors, head bowed, before lifting the coverlet and slipping beneath it. Prayer books were kept near the bed, bound in leather and lined with worn vellum, pages marked by use and reverence. Margins might include notes, private names of those prayed for nightly, children lost, fathers at war, wives gone in childbirth. These names, read in candlelight, were kept alive through prayer. Some even believed that to fall asleep without prayer was an invitation to demons, or, more gently, that one's soul might wander too far in dreams unprotected. So, people prayed not only to rest, but to remain safe while they rested, to have good dreams, to be guarded against the evil eye, to be protected from night terrors, which were not merely psychological afflictions, but signs of possible spiritual disturbance. People prayed for forgiveness, too. As they lay on linen sheets or straw pallets, they thought over the day. The words spoken too harshly, the moments of pride, the anger, they believed it mattered, that to die in one's sleep with an unconfessed sin was dangerous not for the body, but for the soul. So they murmured the Lord's Prayer slowly, earnestly, letting the rhythm carry them toward sleep. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And then there were those who sang themselves to sleep, not with lullabies, but with hymns. Perhaps it was the final verse of a Gregorian chant, still echoing in the mind from Vespers. Or a folk hymn carried down through generations, half remembered, words like spells of comfort, melodies that blurred the lines between prayer and poetry. A favorite was Salve Regina, the hymn to the Virgin Mary, Hail Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, softly, perhaps off, key in the dark. The words were sung not to impress, but to soothe. Some believed the Virgin walked at night, listening for prayers whispered just before sleep. If she heard you, you'd dream of white lilies, of warmth, of light. For the sick, prayers were different, sharper, more urgent. A candle was lit by the bed. Sometimes a relic was placed beneath the pillow, perhaps a bit of cloth touched to a saint's bones, or a tiny scrap of scripture. People prayed to Saint Raphael for healing, or to Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, believed to protect against plague. The prayer wasn't always for healing. Sometimes it was just for peace, that sleep might come without pain, that it might carry them onward, gently, if it must. For women in childbirth, those long nights of groaning pain and uncertain breath prayers were said to Saint Margaret of Antioch, who had burst from the belly of a dragon and was thought to safeguard women in labor. Others prayed to Saint Bridget, whose hands were skilled, or to Mary herself, the mother of sorrows. Husbands would stay awake, pacing, whispering, clutching hands together in rhythm with each contraction. Please, please protect them both. Even dreams were treated with care. A dream was not just the mind wandering. It could be a message, a vision, or a temptation. People prayed to be spared dreams sent by the devil. They prayed for visitations from saints, for glimpses of lost loved ones. There were even recorded prayers asking that one be given a warning of death through a dream, so that they might prepare, not with panic, but with grace. Before sleep, all things became sacred. The bed itself might be sprinkled with holy water. Crosses traced in the air above pillows. Some households, especially in rural villages, would mark the doors with chalk, the initials of the Magi, C+M+B, to keep evil out. Parents would trace crosses on their children's foreheads. Grandmothers would whisper old protective charms in Latin and forget half the words, but remember the spirit. And then silence, the candle flickers, the last word has been said, and the sleeper turns on their side, pulls the wool blanket up to the chin, and lets go, not into chaos, not into fear, but into something deeper, a place where saints walk in dreams and angels keep watch. Even now, if you listen carefully as you drift to sleep, you might hear it, not voices, but presence, as if your bed has grown warmer, as if you are not entirely alone in the dark. Not superstition, no, something older than that. Something softer, the prayers of those long ago, echoing in the hush like distant bells. Sleep well tonight, and may the saints keep you. Silencing the household, snuffing candles, locking doors, latching shutters. The hour grows late. Somewhere in the great hush of a medieval village, a final bell has tolled from the church tower. Its soft echo disappears into the fields and forests beyond, announcing a gentle end to the day. One by one, in manor halls, thatched cottages, and monastery cloisters, small rituals begin to unfurl, quiet, unhurried, and steady as the tide pulling away from the shore. The first sign that sleep is near begins not in the bed, but in the light. In a world before the hum of electricity, light came with cost and care. A candle's flame, though simple and warm, required watchful tending. And so, before sleep could come, each flame had to be extinguished, slowly, intentionally, almost ceremoniously. Imagine a modest peasant home, a single room with a low ceiling of timber and smoke, blackened beams. A mother, her apron dusted with flour, lifts a stub of beeswax candle from the table. The wick dances in the dim light, casting a soft golden glow across her weathered fingers. She cups her hand against the draught, shielding the flame. One by one, she moves from corner to corner, collecting the day's final flickers. Small clay lamps, crude tapers, and oil-soaked rushlight. The last light is always nearest the hearth, where the fire still burns low, not for illumination, but to keep the frost from creeping in too quickly. With a brass snuffer or the pinch of 2 fingers wetted with spit, she extinguishes the flame. A faint thread of smoke rises, curling like a ghost into the beams above. That scent, half beeswax, half soot, was a nightly perfume of the Middle Ages, not unpleasant, familiar. It marked the boundary between labor and rest. In grander households, the process unfolded in miniature procession. A servant moved from chamber to corridor, holding a taper in a silver holder. Tall iron candlesticks, set in corners or along walls, were snuffed in a practiced rhythm. The footman walked quietly, as if not to wake the stones. In some castles, elaborate candle holders could be cranked downward from high ceilings to allow snuffing, a clever bit of medieval engineering that added both elegance and drama to the act. And still, the ritual was not about spectacle. It was about safety. Fire, after all, was as much a threat as it was a comfort. A single forgotten flame could engulf an entire home. And so, households became solemn just before bed. There was no drifting off with a candle still flickering on the bedside table. Even nobles, robed in velvet and reclined on feather beds, were reminded check the candle. Ensure the coals are banked. Sleep comes only after the danger of the day has been tucked away. In monasteries, where silence was already golden, the snuffing of candles marked a transition in time. After the final prayers of Compline, the brothers moved wordlessly through cloisters, extinguishing tapers along stone walls. Their movements were choreographed in reverence, each flame pinched out not with fingers, but with a tool, often shaped like a small bell on a long handle. The final candle in the chapel was extinguished last of all, its light bowing out beneath the stone arches like a priest's whispered benediction. With the light now gone, a different kind of vision took hold. Shadows thickened, corners softened. The world became unfamiliar in the way that only darkness can transform the known. This was not alarming. It was expected. Medieval life embraced the dark. It was a canvas for dreams, a space in which saints could visit, where angels passed, and where the soul wandered while the body lay still. But before the household surrendered fully to sleep, there were final measures to keep the waking world at bay. Doors were locked not with keys as we know them, but often with great wooden bars laid across the inside. A latch would be lowered into place, or a bolt pushed into a slot carved into the stone frame. The clunk of a lock in the night had a sound all its own, satisfying, solid, protective. It said, no more visitors, no more messages. All business, all burdens must wait for the sun. Sometimes a prayer accompanied the action. Bless this house and all within. muttered beneath breath as the bolt was secured. In some homes, a charm was scratched or painted above the door, a protective sigil, a saint's initials, or a small cross in chalk. This wasn't just superstition. It was comfort, assurance. The darkness outside might be full of wolves or witches or wandering souls, but inside the home was guarded. Windows, those fragile eyes of the home, were fastened next. In wealthier homes, these windows held panes of horn or glass, set in lead. But for many, it was merely an open hole covered by a wooden shutter. As dusk deepened, the shutters were drawn closed, and the latch slid into place with a click. In the coldest months, extra cloth was hung across the frames, layered to keep the wind's breath from slipping through. That moment, the latching of shutters was like the home closing its eyes. A blink, a sigh. Sleep was no longer the privilege of the body alone, but of the entire dwelling. For those lucky enough to have servants, this silencing of the household was a shared responsibility. A steward might ensure the outer doors were fastened. A maid might place a cover over the hearth to keep sparks from jumping. A boy would collect any tools left outside, tucking them beneath a lean-to or inside a wooden chest to protect from thieves or frost. In the countryside, dogs were brought inside, not as pets, but as warmth and warning. Their ears twitched at the slightest sound. A growl in the night might be the only notice given before a barn door was forced or a chicken stolen. And so the dogs curled near the fire, their breath slow, their eyes half, lidded but always alert. Even animals had their part in this ritual. Chickens were locked in the coop, cows were tethered and milked early, horses given feed and their stalls swept. The stillness of the night extended beyond the home into the fields, where not even the roosters dared crow before their time. And then there was the silence. It wasn't immediate. It settled gently, like snow. The clatter of bowls ceased. The spinning wheel stood still. The whisper of voices dimmed into nothing. And in its place was the steady rhythm of the home's breath, wood settling, coals popping, the soft sigh of wind against shuttered windows. This silence was not empty. It was full of meaning. It held the weight of the day just past and the anticipation of dreams yet to come. It was a silence known to those who have labored, who have prayed, who have tucked away their worries with the same care as they tucked away the candle. Sometimes a final sound would break it. A child's voice, "Mama, did you lock the door?" A mother's gentle reply, "Yes, love, sleep now." Or the faint creak of a bed as someone shifted beneath woolen blankets, the floor beneath groaning its age. But eventually, even those last echoes fell away. The medieval night had no need for alarm clocks or nightlights. Its rhythm was natural, unhurried, born of darkness and ritual. The home was silent, not only to allow for sleep, but to invite it, to welcome it like an old friend who needed nothing more than quiet and a place to rest. In this darkness something sacred was understood. That rest required trust. Trust that the door would hold, that the shutters would not break, that the fire would not spread, that angels or saints or simple luck would keep the night uneventful. And so the household slumbered, some on feather beds beneath linen sheets, others on straw mats beneath woolen cloaks. Some in silence, others beside snoring siblings or creaking beams, but all of them, peasants and priests, children and crones, lay in the same darkness, the same safety, the same sacred stillness, snuffed candles, locked doors, latched shutters, a home asleep, a world at peace, the breath of hearth embers, banked fires, and the slow fading of warmth. The fire had been the heart of the medieval home all day, crackling with life, its flames licking the iron pot as porridge bubbled and stew thickened. From dawn until dusk, it had been fed small twigs, dry branches, bits of peat or logs, and in return it had warmed cold fingers, cooked meals, dried damp cloaks, and offered a place around which stories were told. But now the day was over. The sun had fled, and the fire, like the people who kept it, needed rest. There was a quiet ritual to putting the hearth to bed. No one simply let a fire burn out. It had to be guided gently towards slumber, like a child being tucked under a blanket. To bank a fire was to smother it softly, not with water, but with care, with ash, with earth, with thoughtfulness. It was a patient farewell to the day's heat, preserving its breath so it might stir again in the morning. The medieval hearth was often a low stone platform in the center of the home, or set against the wall beneath a wide hooded chimney. In humbler dwellings, smoke simply crept out through a hole in the roof, or escaped as best it could, curling around rafters and blackening timbers. By the time the stars were out, the hearth had been cleared of the iron pots and wooden spoons that had crowded it through the day. The cooking was done. The children had eaten their fill and licked their fingers clean. Only embers remained softly glowing beneath a canopy of soot. One by one, the day's chores came to an end. Tools were leaned against the wall. Shoes were pulled off. A final look was given to the night sky, and then someone knelt before the fire. The person who banked the hearth held a quiet kind of authority. It was often the mistress of the house or an older child trusted with the sacred act. There was something almost holy about the moment. They would take a small shovel or scoop and gently pile cool ash over the glowing coals, tamping them down with a practiced hand. The flame dimmed but did not die. Beneath the ash, the heat would remain smoldering quietly, hidden, waiting. Some homes used peat bricks or turf, especially in the highlands and wet areas where trees were scarce. These burned slow and steady, ideal for overnight warmth. Other fires were laid with logs and sticks that had been dried through summer, carefully stacked beside the hearth to avoid dampness. Whatever the fuel, the purpose remained the same, to keep the breath of warmth alive, so that the morning might be greeted not with the struggle of flint and steel, but with the stir of slumbering coals. There is a sound to a banked fire. It is not the lively crackle of flames, but a low, whispering sigh, the gentle collapse of embers as they settle deeper into their own warmth. Now and then a coal will pop, sending a tiny spark upward, where it dies just as quickly in the dark. It is a comforting sound, soft and steady, like the breathing of a great sleeping beast, one that guarded the home through frost and night. Children, tucked into corners on straw pallets or gathered in shared beds, would sometimes fall asleep to that faint breath of embers. It was a lullaby without melody, a rhythm without tempo. It marked the passing of time in a world without clocks. Long before midnight candles or digital blue light, it was the fire that told you the day is finished. Sleep now. In noble houses and castles, the hearth was granite, all enough to stand inside, with chimneys of carved stone and iron grates that hissed and gleamed. But even here, the fire was banked. A servant might be assigned the task, brushing away soot, arranging logs for the next morning, and placing the fire screen before the hearth to protect against stray sparks. In the bedchambers of lords and ladies, smaller braziers were used, metal bowls filled with coals, their warmth enough to take the edge off the chill stone walls. And in monasteries, the act took on almost sacred meaning. Silence cloaked the cloister as a brother moved slowly through the kitchens or infirmary, banking the coals with reverence. The fire was not simply a comfort. It was a gift, a grace. To preserve its warmth was to preserve life. In winter, it could mean the difference between waking with breath and waking not at all. Some even spoke to the fire as they banked it. Not loudly, not in ritual, but in murmured phrases passed down through family lines. Sleep tight, fire. Stay warm till morning. Or rest now, old friend. These were not superstitions, but sentiments, acknowledgments of the fire's place in the family. It was not just heat. It was heart. It was hearth. Even the ashes had purpose. In the morning, when the household stirred again and cold air nipped at bare feet, someone would go to the hearth. They would kneel as if at an altar and gently brush back the ash. With fingers skilled by repetition, they would search for that tiny glow, a coal still red, still breathing. And if they found it, it meant luck. It meant no need to strike flint, no need to coax spark from steel. A little straw, a breath, a careful placing of kindling, and the fire would live again. In this way, each night's fire was not a final chapter, but a pause in a continuous story. Its breath never truly ceased, only quieted, only waited. In the coldest months, homes with banked fires became islands of warmth in a sea of frost. The walls were thin, the roofs not always tight, and winter did not care for comfort. But that hearth, the gentle pulse of embers beneath ash, offered more than heat. It offered reassurance. The fire had been tended, it had been honored, it would return. Think of those long winter nights in the countryside, where snow piled against the door and ice rimed the windows. Outside, wolves howled in the woods, wind moaned like a widow across the hills. But inside, the hearth whispered softly. Beneath blankets and wool, people curled closer to one another, to the dog at their feet, to the heat that lingered near the hearthstone. And though their dreams carried them far into woods, across fields, into prayers and fears and memories, they knew, even in sleep, that something warm was waiting just beyond the edge of night. Even in dreams, the fire was present. It became part of the imagined world, a dancing flame in the corner of one's vision, a red glow behind closed eyes. The fire had become a rhythm of life itself, woven into the very fabric of rest. Sometimes in the dead of night, a sleeper would stir. They might rise to tend a sick child, or to chase off a rat, or to answer the call of nature. In that moment they would glance at the hearth. The ash might shift. The faintest blush of red might still shine through. A whisper of smoke, a faint warmth on the air. The fire had not gone, it waited, and if it had died, truly died, then the morning held work. Flint struck against steel. Sparks caught on char cloth or dry moss. A slow coaxing of flame, but there was no frustration in this, only rhythm. Life in the Middle Ages moved with patience. Nothing was hurried. Nothing was wasted. Even in the act of rekindling, there was intention. Time was not something to be conquered, but something to be lived inside, and so the hearth endured. Day after day, night after night. From the moment a child was born, it knew the hearth's warmth. When a man died, his body lay near the hearth before burial, so that his spirit might rest in warmth one last time. When families told stories, they told them in the firelight. When lovers whispered secrets, it was by the glow of coals. When mothers gave birth, it was near the hearth. When the sick were tended, the fire was fed. It was more than heat. It was hope. A small, persistent defiance against the cold that ruled so much of life. And when it was banked each night, it was not an ending. It was a promise, the promise that warmth would return, that the fire would rise again, that sleep and all it required had been made safe. So the embers sighed beneath their bed of ash, the air stilled, the world hushed, and in homes large and small, grand and humble, the people lay down with trust, not just in God or luck, but in the breath of their own hearth, the breath that, even unseen, still warmed the bones of the house, and as night deepened, the fire slept. And the home, wrapped in its warmth, slept too, listening to the walls, old wood, wind, and the creaks of settling homes. The fire was down to its last sigh, tucked beneath a soft coat of ash. The candles, too, had been extinguished, their smoke trailing lazily upward in thin, silvery lines before vanishing into the dim air. The last whisper of the day had drifted away, and the home now belonged to the night. In the hush that followed, something peculiar happened, something that always happened, though rarely spoken of. The house began to speak, not with words, but with the slow, wandering language of timber and stone. In the quiet, the medieval home breathed in its own way, shifting and sighing and remembering. It was a soundscape that only appeared when everything else fell silent, A sleepy symphony of creaks, groans, whispers in the thatch, the occasional brush of the wind against wood. To live in a medieval house was to live inside a living thing. These were not tightly sealed modern structures with double, glazed silence. These homes breathed. They were built of trees felled by hand, their beams still holding the memory of wind in their grain. Floors, made from raw planks, uneven and splintered, responded to each change in temperature with soft expansion or sudden contraction. Wattle walls woven from willow or hazel and daubed with earth settled slowly as the cool of night crept in. And so, as the house fell into sleep, it began to settle. It began to murmur. Imagine lying on a straw stuffed mattress or beneath woolen blankets on a wooden board, the darkness stretching from floor to rafters like a vast cathedral roof. No lanterns now, no firelight flickering against the walls, only the night, and in that night you'd hear the first low creak from the roof beam. Not threatening, not alarming. Just a gentle complaint from wood that had carried 100 seasons. It was the sort of sound that made you feel small, not in fear, but in comfort, small, like a child being rocked by a giant. The roof above you was held by ancient timbers, often repurposed from even older buildings. These beams had seen centuries. They had once been trees in a forest that knew no names. They had stood through blizzards, watched harvests come and go, soaked up the scent of 1,000 fires. Now, in the hush, they released their memories, a slow groan, a single crackle like the step of a distant foot, a sigh from the boards beneath your bed, as if the house itself shifted in slumber. Even the thatch had its sounds, tightly bound reeds or straw, thick and weather, beaten, covered many medieval roofs. At night the wind might find its way through, slipping between stalks, curling into the attic spaces, and whispering tales no ear could catch. Birds sometimes stirred in the eaves, mice rustled behind the plaster, a beetle might click once, then vanish. But none of this was cause for alarm. It was simply the house doing what houses did, talking in its sleep. In wealthier homes, where stone replaced timber, the sounds were different but still alive. There, the wind moaned in window gaps, and chill crept down walls that seemed to breathe cold into the air itself. Great iron locks might clang softly as the wood around them shifted. Tapestries would rustle with passing drafts. The bones of the building moved with the temperature, like an old man adjusting his limbs before drifting off. These were not haunted houses, though to modern ears they might seem so. They were simply built in an age before insulation, before silence became a virtue. A medieval home never shut the world out completely. It listened, and if you listened back, you could hear the deep, slow pulse of history itself. Many believed the walls held stories not in the way of books, but in the way of breath and rhythm. A child might fall asleep with a hand on the wooden wall beside them, and swear it was warm. A widow might speak to the beams at night, telling them her grief. A farmer, returning late from the fields, might stop in the doorway and hear something in the way the stairs creaked. A kind of welcome, worn but familiar. For those who knew their houses well, each sound was as recognizable as a friend's voice. That pop from the left corner of the attic, that was just the cold finally reaching the joints in the northern beam. That low rumble underfoot, the joist settling, as it always did when the wind turned west, and that tap, tap, tap from the shutter. Only the latch swaying loose again, needing to be mended come morning. This symphony wasn't reserved for country cottages alone. Even in the stone halls of a manor, the night brought sound. The tall windows shuddered in the wind. The tapestries breathed in and out with the chill. Floorboards, polished smooth by generations of footsteps, murmured beneath invisible weight. A steward making his rounds with a candle might pause, convinced he heard footsteps, but no better than to fear. The house was speaking, that was all. In monasteries, where silence was sacred, the sounds of the night became a spiritual presence. A brother lying on a hard cot might find peace in the way the stone wall cooled beside him. or in the creak of the wooden beams above the cloister walk. It was said that a house with no nighttime voice was an unloved one. Only homes full of life could sing after dark. And in the poorest dwellings, mud, walled huts with low rafters and earthen floors, the night chorus was even more immediate. Rats skittered in the corners. The roof might hiss with rain or tremble under snow. Yet still, the soft groans of timber, the whisper of the wind through chinks in the wall, and the tiny complaints of drying thatch gave comfort. The sounds meant that the house was still holding, that no matter the storm outside, this place remained yours. Over time, these nightly noises became part of the very act of sleeping. Just as one might be soothed by the breath of a loved one beside them, or the rise and fall of a dog's chest at their feet, so too did the creaks and moans of the house lull its people to rest. They were not intrusions, they were invitations. There was no expectation of silence. Silence, in fact, was the thing to fear. A house gone silent might mean something had shifted too far, that a beam had given way, that frost had crept too deep. Silence was a break in the pattern, but the soft sounds, those were life. To the modern ear, tuned to mechanical hums and artificial stillness, such noises might seem eerie, but for the medieval sleeper, they were as natural as birdsong at dawn. Even in towns and cities, where houses leaned shoulder-to-shoulder, older like old friends sharing secrets, the night sounds were ever present. The cobblestones echoed with the last clatter of hoofbeats. Then came the groan of the upper floor timbers, holding up rooms where families now slept. The clink of iron against wood as shutters trembled. Somewhere, a tavern door closed with a final thud. After that, the houses took over. Their whispers filled the void left by people. People often described homes as having character. Not charm, not beauty, character. Some were known to be fussy, their stairs creaking indignantly with each ascent. Others groaned so contentedly in winter that they seemed to hum, and some homes, old and wise, made barely a sound at all, except when it mattered most. There were tales of walls that wept during storms, or rafters that moaned before the birth of a child. People listened, they paid attention. The house was not just wood and stone. It was memory, it was witness, it was guardian. So when the candles had been snuffed and the hearth banked, when the last sighs of conversation had faded and all that remained was darkness, what was left was not stillness. It was presence, a creak in the rafter, a whisper through the shutter, a slow, familiar groan from the floor, and then the soft breath of the sleeper answering. Each night, the home and its people fell asleep together. Each night, the walls told stories in the only way they knew how. Each night, history murmured softly through the timber and wind, waiting to be heard by those who had learned to listen. And so you lay, wrapped in wool and linen, your breath quiet, your eyes closed. Outside, the wind played with the eaves, brushing past the thatch with ancient fingers. The wall beside you creaked once, thoughtfully. Somewhere above, a beam groaned in its old voice, then fell still. You did not stir. The house was simply speaking, and in time it too fell silent, and sleep, thick and dreamless, came at last. The comfort of repetition, nightly prayers and whispered blessings. The light is nearly gone, yet it clings to the corners, thin, fading like the last breath of incense in a chapel. The fire has dimmed to an amber glow. The day, with all its clamor, has fallen quiet, and within the hush a single voice begins to murmur. It is not a loud voice, not theatrical nor commanding, but soft, familiar, worn smooth by nightly use. It is the voice of prayer. For the people of the medieval world, each evening was bordered not just by the setting of the sun, but by the ritual of words. Quietly spoken, sometimes aloud, and sometimes only mouthed in the silent dark, these prayers were as dependable as the turning stars. A man might forget his tools in the field. A child might misplace their wooden toy. But prayers were stitched into the soul. And so, when the household prepared to sleep, there was one final task before the letting down of hair, before the turning in of straw, before shutters were latched and darkness welcomed. That task was to speak to the divine, to murmur into the night the same old words said the night before, and the night before that, and 100 nights before. There was comfort in that sameness. To live in the medieval world was to live with unpredictability. Storms could ruin a crop, illness could steal a child. War, famine, fire, or plague, these were not distant threats but daily possibilities. And so people turned to repetition not out of superstition, but out of deep, longing hope. If today had passed safely, then perhaps a whispered Ave Maria might help tomorrow do the same. Imagine a family kneeling by the hearth, still warm from cooking. The fire flickers low, casting orange across their bowed heads. They are not literate, most of them. They cannot read Latin, but they know the rhythm of the prayers by heart. The same rhythm their mothers knew, the same cadence their grandfathers sang into the dusk. Hail Mary, full of grace. Our Father, who art in heaven. God bless mother and father and little John, and the oxen, and the fields, and the wheat that must grow strong. Not every prayer was formal. Many were spoken in the home's native tongue, Middle English, Old French, Welsh, or Lombard dialects. Some were half song, half plea. Others were merely whispered wishes strung together with reverence. Keep the wolves away. Let the baby wake in the morning. Let the frost stay high on the mountain. Let me rise. In great castles, priests might lead compline in stone chapels, their voices echoing through candlelit transepts, the Latin chanted low, the incense curling upward. But even in these lofty halls, the servants below stairs would have their own humbler ritual. A whispered line while folding rough linens, a sign of the cross etched invisibly on the threshold before extinguishing the torch. It was repetition that soothed. These words, ancient, unchanging, offered something the physical world rarely could: predictability. In a world where illness might strike without warning and fields might flood overnight, the constancy of prayer was deeply grounding. Children clung to these rituals. Many slept in shared beds, sometimes 5 or 6 to a straw mattress, elbows tucked, knees folded like curled puppies in a den. Before sleep, one of them, often the eldest, might begin the litany, a string of rhyming prayers they could chant like a lullaby. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed that I lie on. Eyes would drift shut before the verse had ended, and if someone forgot a line, another would murmur it in their place. For monks and nuns, the structure was even more rigid. Their entire lives orbited around prayer, and each hour of the night had its designated verse. But even in the cloistered stillness, repetition worked like a bomb. A brother might wake in the dark, recite his psalms by candlelight, and feel the same peace he'd known every night for 40 years. But even outside monasteries, in cottages nestled in wooded hollows, in farmsteads miles from any church bell, the words still came, the same words every night, carried through generations like a treasured charm. Some prayers were whispered to saints: Saint Apollonia for toothache, Saint Blaise for the throat, Saint Brigid for protection in the cold months. Others called directly to the Virgin Mary, regarded not only as the mother of Christ, but the mother of all who suffered. Cover me with your mantle, some would say, or be my light in the darkness. Parents prayed over their children, often quietly. A father might lean over his son's sleeping form, place a rough hand on the boy's head, and say the words he once heard his father say to him. A mother, wiping ash from her apron, might pause by the crib and whisper a string of blessings into the downy hair of her baby. Bless his breath, bless her bones, bless the dreams that come to him, bless the stars that keep their watch. These blessings weren't always sanctioned by the church. Some were local, folk words, a mix of pagan tradition and Christian belief, all woven together in nightly comfort. The church frowned on some of these old customs, but they persisted, because they worked, not in a magical sense, but in a human one. There was power in repeating something good, power in rhythm, power in closing the day the same way every night. Some households prayed aloud together, others in silence. Some lit a final taper for the purpose. Others simply folded their hands in bed. It was not the grandeur that mattered, but the doing, the regularity, the humble, hopeful belief that these words, quiet, soft, unseen, might make the night kinder. And it wasn't only humans who received these whispered blessings. The hearth was sometimes blessed, especially in winter. Bread was crossed before it was sliced. Even the animals had their prayers. A cow, belly round with calf, might be touched on the flank and blessed by name. The dog by the door might hear his master whisper, "Keep the dark at bay, old friend," before the final shutter was drawn. The words were not fancy, but they were old and they were loved. Even those who lived alone spoke them. A widow with trembling hands might still clasp them each night, and begin her prayer with no one to hear but the wind. A shepherd high in the hills might kneel beside his fire, say a few lines to the stars, and lie down on the earth with a quiet heart. It was not about being heard. It was about speaking and being still, and letting the night come gently. For some, prayer was the only privacy they ever had. In cramped quarters, in rooms shared by siblings and elders and animals alike, those few moments of whispered words were sacred, a time to be truly alone, truly themselves, to ask questions, to plead, to thank, to hope. Sometimes the prayers were short, sometimes long, sometimes so tangled with emotion that the speaker had to stop, wipe their eyes, and begin again. They might ask for small things. Let the bread rise tomorrow. Let my brother return from the road. Let my hands not hurt so much. Or they might ask for nothing at all, but simply say thank you. Thank you for the roof that held, for the lamb that survived, for the love I have, even if I have little else. And when the final word was spoken, there was no applause. No sign from the sky, just a feeling, a deep, settling quiet. The kind that presses gently behind your eyes. The kind that folds you inward like a warm blanket. Sleep often came soon after. And though the world outside might rage, wolves in the woods, ice on the panes, bandits on the roads, the home itself felt calmer, more anchored, as if the house, too, had heard the prayers and taken them to heart. And so, every night, across hill and field, in castle and cottage, voices lifted, not loudly, not grandly, but earnestly, in repetition, in rhythm, in love, until they grew faint, until they grew still, until only the breath remained. And the house and the night and the soul itself rested. And so, dear listener, as the candles burn low and the echoes of old prayers soften into silence, let your own breath settle like dust on a windowsill untouched for centuries. The night has always held its secrets, and for those long gone, bedtime was never rushed. It was a quiet surrender, a ritual, a rhythm of trust in the coming dawn. May the hush of medieval chambers, the whispered blessings, and the flicker of fading hearths stay with you now, drifting through your dreams like smoke curling through oak rafters. Rest now, gently, as they did long ago. Good night.